I now recognize Mr. Lieberman for his opening statement.
Chair Burleson, Grothman, Ranking Members Frost and Krishnamurthy, and members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ben Lieberman, and I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a nonpartisan public policy organization dedicated to advancing the principles of free markets and limited government. CEI has been critical of the Green New Deal since it was first advanced in 2019. We were particularly concerned about the burdens its many climate-related measures would place on the American people in the form of costlier energy, transportation, and housing. Unfortunately, our concerns are being realized now that these Green New Deal-style provisions have been incorporated into the badly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which was enacted into law in 2022. When the IRA was under consideration by Congress, the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation released cost projections of its energy-related tax credits and other subsidies. At the time, the price tag for the energy provisions in the IRA was estimated at about $370 billion for the 10-year period from 2022 to 2032. And this was a score that informed the debate over the bill. Only 2 years after passage, CBO and JCT more than doubled this estimate. Other projections see costs potentially reaching into the $1 trillion range, including Goldman Sachs, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Cato Institute. The Cato report notes that the upper bound of these estimates is complicated by the fact that several provisions do not set dollar limits or deadlines. Most notably, the clean electricity tax credits for wind and solar can be used by as many project developers that want to claim them, and they do not sunset until U.S. greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced to 25% of baseline 2022 levels, a target unlikely to be met for many decades and possibly never. The high and rising costs of the Inflation Reduction Act are all the more objectionable given the deceptive title of this bill. The American people were not informed that this was a massive climate bill, and they never agreed to any such thing. The fact that the price tag is likely north of $1 trillion makes this perhaps the costliest example ever of congressional bait and switch. But the costs don't end there. Nearly every alternative energy source and technology favored under the Inflation Reduction Act has shortcomings that are not likely to go away no matter how many subsidies are given to them. First and foremost, in contrast to the electricity generated from coal, natural gas, nuclear, or hydroelectric, intermittent renewable electricity sources like wind and solar are not reliably available 24/7. Experts at organizations like the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, are warning of an increased risk of blackouts this summer, and the report specifically mentions the risk from periods of low wind and solar output. Note also that we're adding to electric reliability risks at the same time electricity demand is on the rise, due in part to other provisions in the IRA favoring electric vehicles over gasoline-powered ones, as well as electric appliance over natural gas versions. Thus, we face the double whammy of provisions in the IRA reducing the reliability of the grid, while other provisions seek to make Americans less energy diverse and more dependent on electricity. In other words, we're trying to put more of our eggs in one basket while switching to a flimsier basket. Subsidies beget subsidies, and the build-out of wind energy, for example, will likely necessitate major investments in transmission lines, by some estimates into the trillions of dollars. We were likely to see more lobbying for subsidies to do so. The American people don't want yet another potential trillion-dollar climate bill any more than they wanted the first one. The provision for consumers, such as the tax credits for EVs and certain appliances, may make costlier alternatives somewhat less so, but they are not for the things most of us want. And these provisions are highly regressive as they simply don't make economic sense for most lower-income households, even with the subsidies. In conclusion, the tax credits and other subsidies for alternative energy sources and technologies in the Inflation Reduction Act will likely exceed $1 trillion in costs to the American people. The distortions to energy markets will impose further burdens. Consumers will bear the brunt of these impacts and disproportionately lower income ones. For these reasons, all of these provisions should be repealed. Thank you.
Mr. Lieberman, When the IRA was originally sold, it was sold to the American people as a legislative vehicle for reducing inflation and for stimulating the economy and creating lots of jobs, lots of new clean energy jobs. But what is the actual result of the legislation been?
Well, there are a lot of jobs right now. I think we're going through the sugar high phase of the Inflation Reduction Act. Sure, you can create a lot of jobs if you throw a lot of money at just about anything, especially lots of federal dollars. The question is, do these alternative energy sources have any lasting power? The American people are not pounding the table demanding higher utility bills and more expensive transportation. And so these alternatives need to become cost competitive to have any real future. And I just don't see that happening with most of the alternative being subsidized right now. And I would say there's a long history with this, and it doesn't bode very well. Congress is not nearly as good as it thinks it is in figuring out what the next big thing in energy is. It's been trying this since the oil shocks of the 1970s, but there's been a lot of boondoggles along the way. Not really much in the way of alternative energy success stories that we can point to. One example I could mention from when I was a staffer 10 years ago, when the next big thing was cellulosic biofuels. I don't know if you remember cellulosic, but there were all sorts of tax credits and other incentives adding up to dollars per gallon, very similar to what you see for other things in the Inflation Reduction Act. The facilities were built, and it turned into a boondoggle, including a lot of communities that felt cheated because the permanent jobs never materialized. I fear that if we come back in 5 years, we'll be talking about a number of clean energy ghost towns as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, in 1850, the economist Frederick Bastiat wrote, I think, about this scenario back then and recognized that you could make the argument that you're creating a lot of jobs by going down the street and breaking windows, right? Because somebody has to be employed to replace those windows. But there's a fallacy with that because of the destructive nature and the wealth that's destroyed in that process. Would you agree that this holds true with the IRA today?
Yeah, when you're creating jobs only because of subsidies, that means that money and jobs has to be siphoned away from the rest of the economy. So there's always two sides of the jobs ledger when government subsidies are involved, and we're talking about potentially $1 trillion. Plus, if at the end of the day you have more expensive energy, that also suppresses economic activity and jobs.